Welcome to the very first episode of our new podcast series, Brainwise, Our Lives Decoded. I am your host, Cole Bastian, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Dixon, and we are extremely excited to begin this journey with you. Phil, as we dive in and get started today, give us a little bit of information about you and tell us who you are and why the listeners are going to want to get to know you.
Again, Phil Dixon, glad to be here. You've probably gathered from my accent, I'm not from America. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. I've traveled around the world and finished up in North Carolina with my wife, Kathy, and our two dogs. I'll give you some of my academic and corporate experience later.
Phil and I aren't too far away from one another. We are joined together right now by the virtual web space. I live in Georgia with my spouse, Joseph Bastian. We live just outside of Atlanta with our two dogs, but our dogs are a little smaller than your dogs. I think last time we spoke, you told me that your dogs are like 80 and 90 pounds, possibly.
That's exactly right. Yeah, they're heavy beasts.
Yeah, we've got a miniature golden doodle and a Maltipoo, so 30 pounds and 8 pounds respectively. They're actually getting groomed today, which is exciting. They'll come back looking super duper cute.
I think our dogs call your dogs lunch.
Yeah, or an appetizer, depending on which one you're talking about. Phil, one of the things that we've been talking about, you and I have known one another for quite some time, around 7-8 years. And I've had the privilege of being able to call you mentor and most importantly, friend. And I have learned so much along that experience. And as we've gone on this journey, one of the things that I know is you're a neuroscience expert, and there's so much that you know about the brain. And as you've shared that information, it's begun to help me be able to navigate the world that I live in, both personally and professionally, in a more seamless way, in a more effective way, and be able to really understand myself to a degree that I didn't fully know prior to. And as we've been talking about what's happening in the world around us today, regardless of how one might vote, whether you live in the United States or you live outside of the US, or what's happening in your personal life, there's just so many things that are happening that may be positively impacting our experience, or maybe it's more negatively impacting the experience. And we were talking and I just mentioned, I'm like, what if we started a podcast and began to share the same information that I've been learning from you over the last number of years, but we share it with everyone else so they could start to begin to really decode their life from a brain perspective and begin to learn how can they understand and make sense of what's happening around them. So, Phil, what would you like to add to the reasoning for why we're here? And then share with the listeners a little bit about why are the expert in neuroscience? Because you truly are.
Thanks for the compliments. So why we're here? I think for all the reasons you just said, in helping understand what's going on in the wider world and why we all react the way we do, my passion at the moment is helping people understand their brains so that they can actually have better lives. Period. That's it. And why it's important, I think, is that nothing, this is going to be a double negative here, but nothing happens that doesn't start right between our ears. In this organ, it's about 3 pounds. It's a wonderfully complex, incredible organ that we still don't fully understand. Well, a long way, we're just scratching the surface. But everything starts right between our 2 ears. So that's the reason why it's important. Why I became, thanks for calling me an expert, but I feel like every day I'm learning something about the brain. So a very quick background, I worked for Apple for a period of time. And in Apple, I was running a lot of their leadership development programs. And even when I left Apple, I got more and more frustrated that I couldn't get better quality development of leaders. And in the end, I was doing a master's degree and I happened across the neuroscience of the brain. And I said, that's what I've been looking for all these years. That caused me to pivot. And everything I've been doing since 2009 has been around the brain. And so a couple of years later, people said, what book should I read? And there aren't too many easily approachable books. So I wrote a couple of my own. So that's how I got here, learning every day, literally every morning.
Yeah, I absolutely love it.
What about you?
I wouldn't call myself maybe an expert on the brain. I'm learning every day that you and I are together, but I would say that I'm an expert in when it comes to understanding behaviors of individuals and specifically at an organizational level. I have my master's in industrial organizational psychology, and I've been working for probably the better half of the last decade or almost a decade in leadership development, in organizational change management for a well-known brand that a lot of us know that's called Hooters. That's actually where you and I met many years ago through a mutual friend and colleague of ours, and have been able to really begin to, how do you apply what is the theoretical concepts of some of these things that we talk about in IO psychology or in leadership development programs, but then take it from the theoretical perspective and begin to actually make it applicable and it actually begin to make sense from an intervention perspective. Because I think that's where it begins to have true change and begin to actually drive results and help people within the organization understand themselves better and be able to navigate the experiences that they're having and ultimately be able to be better leaders and better individuals. So I think there's a really cool blend of experience and approaches, both from our backgrounds and our personal perspectives. So I think that the listeners are going to be able to get some really cool things from both of us, as well as I'm sure over the series of this podcast, there's going to be things that we're going to learn from the listeners as they share information that they find and ask questions. And I think we're both lifelong learners is one of the things that I've learned after knowing you for so long, is that I don't know everything. And so what can I continue to learn and apply and begin to always grow and evolve as I go along this journey that we call life. Phil, what else would you like to share before we dive into the first episode, which really is going to lay the foundation on all things the brain?
I'm ready to go.
Very good. So let's go ahead and start off by looking at and talking about really all things the foundation of the brain. And so let's go to the beginning. Can you give our listeners, Phil, a high-level overview of what we call the 5 principles of the brain? We're going to go through each of them in more detail throughout this podcast, but can you give them a point of reference as to what those 5 principles are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to count them on one hand. Number 1 is your brain has one primary purpose, and that is your survival. Period. That's all she wrote. 2, it operates in 2 modes, a conscious mode and a non-conscious mode. And we'll come to discuss that in a lot more detail. Probably that'll come up in probably every one of our episodes. 3, it's structured in 3 layers, which actually can be identified in the brain. 4, when something happens and it triggers something off for you, there are 4 processes that get triggered off. 5, there are 5 driving forces, and they are: we want to feel protected, we want to participate with other people, we want to predict what's going on, we want to have a purpose, and we want some pleasure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I love it. Easy to remember. There's 5 principles of the brain, and we're going to dive in now to the very first one, which you shared, is that our brain has really one core purpose, which might be new information, Phil, for some of those who are listening to this podcast who are listening. It might be the first time they've heard that. So can you help them understand what is that core purpose and why is it that the brain has that one core purpose?
So if you go back 1 million years, or however long it is, we don't actually know, but go back a long time, then we were driven by the need for survival. And certain things contributed that. In order to survive, you had to be around people, you had to feel protected, or you had to be protected. You didn't want to be eaten, you needed to be warm. Yeah, you wanted to eat rather than be eaten. Yeah. So all of those things were, and that was where the brain evolved from. In fact, there's a guy called John Medina. He's a neuroscientist, and he sums that up really well. And that is, he says the brain is a problem-solving mechanism for solving problems about survival while on the outside in constantly changing conditions and constantly on the move, right? The brain, those 3 things, changing conditions, outside, and constantly on the move. And you could almost turn around and say you could learn something right there, because most of us spend our time when we're trying to think about a problem sitting inside in one place at a desk and not moving. So that is
Right.
exactly the opposite for what the brain is structured to do. So your brain is structured for one thing, your survival.
It's absolutely fascinating, Phil. And I think it's such important information as we think about our daily life. And one of the things, Phil, that I know that you've talked about a lot is around how the brain is scanning for threats and rewards, or that is looking for things on a pretty rapid pace. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I know that it's like every 1/5 of a second or something like that. I don't want to misquote or anything, but can you give some context and detail behind that? Because I think that our listeners are going to really find that fascinating at truly how marvelous the brain is and how much their brain is working on just a near constant basis.
It is. If you think that you're relaxing and you're doing nothing, that's not what the brain is doing. The brain is always working hard. And that is the brain looks around, is scanning its environment, looking for threats and rewards. So it's part of the brain that's actually oriented towards, is this a threat? Is this a reward? Doing that every 1/5 of a second, constantly. So yeah, it sorts it out at a later point in time, but it learns from both threat and reward.
Interesting. And that's connected to the purpose of survival that it's scanning for, correct?
Yeah. And in fact, we have 5 times as much circuitry in the brain for picking up threat as we do reward. And again, evolution would explain that in that, hey, if a million years ago, if you weren't attuned to surviving and looking for threat, then your genes aren't in the gene pool. You died and you didn't survive. So a highly attuned 5-to-1 ratio of threat to reward.
It's just absolutely fascinating. And truly, it's marvelous how much information the brain can be processing every single second of every single day. And really, it's probably why I get tired all the time because my brain is constantly scanning my environment to determine, is this a threat or is this a reward? And it's probably also, I would assume, why rest is so important, which I'm sure we'll talk about some of those things as we move along our podcast series to give people some real good application. Phil, one of the things as we move into the second principle of the brain around the modes of the brain that you were describing, you talk about how much of what we do is non-conscious. We have this conscious part of our brain, things that we're aware of, and then there's this non-conscious part of the brain. Walk us through the difference of what we're doing and what our brain is doing behind the scenes, and give us a bit more clarity so that the listeners are able to understand the two differences.
I'll do my best. I want to just flag a point that we need to come back to when you mentioned about your brain getting tired. Put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that at some point in time, either later in this or in another series, because that's a really important part. Part of the brain actually does get depleted during the day, and that's important for us to remember. Okay, conscious, non-conscious. Let's play a little game, if that's okay with you, and encourage the listeners, if you're not driving, join in the little game here. And that is, how warm are you at the moment, Cole?
I would say I'm temperate. Okay. I have shivered, yes.
Yeah, but you're not at the moment.
No.
No. And what happens when you shiver?
Probably get chilly, or maybe a ghost passes by. I'm not sure, depending on what's happening.
We all shiver for different reasons. Some people shiver at the thought of something exciting. Some people shiver at just getting cold, or, as you said, somebody walks over your grave. But your brain, I'm suspecting your brain didn't go, I know, let's shake in order to get all those muscles working and get warm. It's going on. It's going on in the background. That's an example of a non-conscious behavior. It's a trivial one, but it's a good example. The other thing I would say is, and I hate to ask you this, but have you ever blushed?
Yes. I'm probably blushing right now, actually, now that you ask.
Right. But did your brain go, oh, Phil's asked me an awkward question, I better blush? No, it's going on in the background. So those are two examples. I'll give you a third one. And again, if you're driving, don't try this. And that is, if you pay attention to your feet, right? And I'd like you to waggle your left big toe. Okay, you got it?
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you noticing about your left big toe now?
It's moving.
Okay. Is it moving on its own? Ask, because some people can't do that.
Yeah, I think I might have shared at one point my toes are double jointed on that one side. And so I've always been able to do that. It's probably too much information for the listeners, but hey, they're going to get to know quite a bit about us on this podcast series. So why not start now?
Yeah, certainly. I didn't know that about you. So thank you. Yeah. Okay. So what else do you notice about, I'll start asking you questions. How warm is your toe?
It's temperate.
Temperate. Okay. The texture, can you feel any textures?
Yes, there is a hardwood floor underneath my toe or my foot. I don't have socks on because I'm in my home office. And the hardwood floor is warm because my foot's been in that spot for quite some time now.
Okay. All right. What about, so it's not tight because you're not wearing shoes. Some will be wearing socks and shoes and go, yeah, actually, since you mention it, it feels pretty tight. Mm-hmm. Where was all that data going 2 minutes ago when I hadn't brought your attention to it?
It had to have been going to the non-conscious part of my brain.
That's exactly right. Now, if I had stamped on your foot, it would be coming into the conscious part of your brain. But as it is, it's going on in the background. And lots of that stuff is going on in the background. In fact, wow. That's the sort of qualitative description. Quantitatively, the brain processes about 11 million bits of information per second. And I'll put that in context in a minute. But of those 11 million bits of information, it's about 100 that you're dealing with on a conscious basis. So it's about a ratio of 1 in a million. So these are not co-equal parts of the brain. Wow. No, I won't go political on this right now. Just to put things in context, the average conversation is about 60 bits of information per second. So your brain can pay attention to one conversation and maybe a little bit of another one, but as soon as you get more than two conversations going on, brain gets confused, can't handle it.
That is absolutely fascinating that our brains are handling that amount of information at that speed. And so I have a question for you. Is part of the reason that's happening because we don't want, or our brains would possibly overheat, or something might happen if we were processing all of that in a conscious way?
That's probably true. We'll come back to the brain overheating at a later point in time, either in this or subsequent episode. But yeah, the brain does everything it can to minimize the use of energy. I'll address that for a moment. The brains are typically about 3 pounds. So it's depending who you are, 1.5%, 2% of your body weight. But it consumes 20% of your body's energy at rest.
Wow.
So it's an energy hog. And there are parts of the brain that actually are unequal in the amount of energy that they want. I'll get back into more detail. I'm going to dive into it. You may know I love this stuff.
Yes, we can definitely see that. And it's excellent information that I'm sure I know I didn't know, and that our listeners, I'm sure, are really eager to want to hear even more about. I'm sure that, Phil, as you were asking me to do those activities, that our listeners were doing those right along with us. And it's absolutely fascinating that the brain truly can process all of that information in a non-conscious way, and that it can help keep us focused on the things that are the most important. And of course, keep us safe from a survival perspective. So there was a third principle that you mentioned around involving layers of the brain. And for now, we discussed that we're going to go ahead and save that particular principle to go further in depth for a later episode, because it gets into a bit more of the science of things. So we'll come back in the future with more detail on it. But let's go to the fourth principle that you shared, which is around the process involving detecting cues. So once this cue is detected, what does the brain do next? What's the process?
First of all, I want to mention that the science part you mentioned there. We will keep science to a minimum. There's going to be some things that we have to talk about, science words, but we're going to keep all the words and jargon to an absolute minimum. Anybody know their Latin? Don't worry about it. We've got you covered. So the 4 parts, yes, when something happens to us, we call it cue detection. That's the first thing that comes up. And the cue detection triggers off, first of all, it triggers off an emotion. And that is a fear or a surprise or joy or disgust or any of those type of fundamental emotions. That in turn triggers off, I like to think of it as two things going on in parallel: a feeling process and a thinking process. Thinking is, what do I understand about this? What do I know about it? Is this a new experience to me? Those type of activity. The feeling is triggering off, might be shivering, it might be excitement, it might be your stomach tensing or something like that. It's a bodily sensation. So those two things, your brain then determines what it wants to do next. Do I want to smile? Do I want to run away, or whatever it might be? And so there is actually a response, and we generally call it self-control. It's emotion, feeling, thinking, and self-control. Those are the four. There is a school of thought that says you feel first and think second. There's another school of thought that says you think first and feel second. I just to look at they go in parallel.
Interesting. Phil, one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're describing all of this is that, so when, especially at work, so let's talk about the work context first, and then maybe we'll go into some of the more personal context after that. But one of the things that's very interesting to me is, as you're describing this, is that when I'm in meetings, a lot of times I'll see something, someone's tone will shift, or maybe they're dismissive of someone else's idea in a meeting. And that is what happens is then someone else in the meeting immediately shuts down. And others in the room look at that and they make comments, or they might question and they go, why is that person shutting down? That's a character flaw. But in reality, it's just that person's response to the trigger that they received or that they experienced from the person who was either dismissive or experiencing the tone shift, which we talked a little bit about, you and I have previously, around how sometimes the social threats are somewhat maybe related or can be perceived similarly to the physical threats. Can you give us a little bit of information around that? Because I think it's very interesting, and our listeners, I think, will find it very fascinating as we talk about this, the process and the cue detection piece, and how those two are very similar, if not almost the same, as you describe it.
Yeah, so there's lots and lots of good stuff to talk about in here. But first of all, what you mentioned is social. We call things like being dismissed, or someone being rude to you, or ignoring you, or bad-mouthing an idea, whatever it may be. We call them social or emotional threats. And we distinguish those to physical threats, which is, hopefully none of us experience too many of them. But if somebody was to go to slap you around the face, it is both a threat and you receive the pain. Mm-hmm. What we discovered in about 2007, so it's a recent discovery, was that the circuitry in the brain that processes social and emotional threats is 98% the same as the circuitry that processes physical threats. Wow. So to the brain, it doesn't make a difference between whether you're actually slapping someone or insulting them. It feels the same to the brain. And in fact, we use the words. We say, for example, you broke my heart, right? A physical word to describe an emotional experience. And the brain it conflates the two. And so when you're in a meeting, if you just turn around and say, that's a stupid idea, it's person's brain, it's like you slapped them around the face.
Wow. Interesting.
And when we detect a tone change, there's been a lot of research, actually, many of it done by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab, found is that we are 96% accurate on detecting those small, subtle changes, both in facial expression and in tonality. We're good at it. And again, if I could understand what's going on with a small change, maybe I can predict what the behavior of that person's going to be and survive.
It's just truly fascinating. It reminds me that there's that old adage that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is probably not really accurate in this sense based off what you're describing. It maybe won't hurt you physically, but it's going to ultimately somewhat feel the same as it hurting you.
Yeah, and one of the big differences, so yes, you're absolutely right, that adage is a little crazy, but the biggest difference is if you experience physical pain, some point of time later, it's gone. It's emotional pain. It will often stay with you for the rest of your life. Yeah. That's another big difference between the two of them.
For sure. Yeah. And it's absolutely true, because when I coach individuals, one of the things that I often share with them is people will they always forget contextually what happens in a situation, but they will almost never forget how you made them feel
Yep.
in that situation. And there could be a stimulus or some kind of trigger response that ultimately brings all of those emotions back. They can't say necessarily what exactly happened that made them feel that way, but they know that you are the source of that feeling. Whether it be positive or negative is somewhat irrelevant, but they will feel those things. So it's very important to watch how we show up in those spaces. Phil, I know that we're going to go into more in depth here, but because our podcast series is going to be around both the work aspect or the professional perspective and also the more personal or social perspective, I'd like to give maybe one click into this, if you would, around what we just talked about with the emotional threats and how our brains respond in the work environment. I know personally that when I'm talking to my spouse, that we're having a conversation and I get triggered, that response and the feeling that I have becomes even more severe to some degree in terms of what I'm experiencing, even though I know I'm in a safe environment comparatively, probably to what's happening at work sometimes. Why is that? Why is the emotional response that I'm experiencing even more impacted than perhaps it is at work, knowing that I'm in a safe environment at home versus what might be somewhere else? I just think it's interesting to maybe give them one click down, knowing we're going to come back to this particular conversation in the future.
I'm going to skim over the surface of that to start with. It does require going into some level of detail. But when let's say that your spouse has said something to you, it triggers off your threat response. Okay. What happens there is that there's a hormone released into both the brain and the body. We'll get to what it's called in a moment. And part of the job of that hormone is to close down your rational thinking and bring up your emotional thinking. So that's all I'm going to say about that at the moment. We'll go into a lot more detail. So at that point, you're not rationally going, oh, now I understand why my spouse said that because this happened last week or whatever it might be. That part of your brain gets closed down. The emotional, socially emotional response goes, I hate that when that happens. And that's what starts to become your driver. And so, and that, to help you out a little bit, the best thing you can do if that happens is actually walk away. That hormone takes between 2 and 5 hours to disappear, depending on your metabolism, etc. And sometimes they go, yeah, just walk away, spend a couple of hours apart, come back together again. That brings your rational part of the brain back in, and you can start having a rational conversation where you can't when you've just been triggered.
Well, thank you for sharing. I know that our listeners that are listening right now are certainly going, okay, I can't wait to hear the episode where we talk about that specifically, because whether it's with your spouse or someone that you really care about, it does seem to be that there is a more heightened emotional response sometimes to those particular triggers than it would be with someone else, which I just think is so fascinating.
And I'm about to jump into the fifth principle, if that's okay, because it's a perfect segue. And what actually does trigger you, and what triggers you will be in one of those big five that we mentioned: protection, participation, prediction, pleasure, and purpose. So should I dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, let's go into it. Those are what we call the five driving forces of the brain. So let's get started. Let's share with them.
So protection, that covers. So go back, and we mentioned it earlier on. You needed shelter, you needed warmth, you needed food, you needed to be safe so you weren't eaten. Those are all part of protection. Nowadays, there's some additional things. So if you go back a million years, our brains were designed around survival. Now, come forward to where we are today, our brains are still at version 1.0. Society is at 25.0. It's changed. So the things that trigger us now aren't necessarily those same things. Right? In addition is, hey, is that report ready? Well, how's my 401k doing? Am I going to be full of traffic, jump into traffic on the way home? Those are the sort of things that trigger us as well now. Unfairness is an important one, and we'll come back and explain that. Do I feel financially secure? There's a whole bunch of things like that actually make us feel whether or not we're protected. That's the protection. Participation is, hey, let me ask you a question. Are you working on your own or with other people?
I prefer working with other people.
Yeah. But there's many people who prefer to work on their own. If you put them with other people, they're not great from a social point of view. If you like you and make you work on your own, then some people even get to the point they're debilitated. They can't unless they've got some collaboration going on. We're different. We've identified a total of something like 60 different factors that actually determine whether we get triggered about something. So the participation is, do I get to work with people I like? Do they support me? Do I feel like my voice is heard? Can I explore a different point of view without being abused by the rest of them? So that's all about participation. The third is prediction. The brain's perspective is that if it can understand what's about to happen, it can better position you for survival. So if you know in the workplace, if you know what's expected of you, how you're going to get rewarded, i.e. your pay, your bonus, whatever it might be. In the home environment are you rewarded by coming home and being with your spouse? So if you can predict what's going to happen, the brain says, I can help you survive. That goes even to the point where, do you have control over your life, where it's headed? If you don't feel like you have control, that can trigger you as well. So those are the three big ones that tend to be threat oriented if they're not addressed. And again, we're all over the map on that. Some people are triggered by someone just slightly ignoring them. Other people don't even notice it. We're all different.
Right.
In terms of the last two, which are more reward oriented, are what I'll call pleasure and purpose. Pleasure, relatively obvious. Can I have intimacy? Can I have physical pleasure? Can I have sitting in front of a warm fire out in the sun, enjoying reading a book, all those type of things? The purpose is, do you know what your purpose is in life? Many people don't. We love challenge just at the edge of what we're able to do. And so people say, stretch yourself. Yeah, that's part of purpose of life. So we can go and we can dig into what are those characteristics. I can go on in a lot of detail and I can bore people to death for the next 24 hours, but I won't.
And Phil, as I was listening, it just reminds me of, as I'm hearing the description for myself, I believe that, and I know that based on what you're describing, the two areas from a threat orientation perspective that probably would trigger me the most is around participation and prediction. Knowing if I am able to predict what the outcomes are going to be, in knowing what they're going to be, having some degree of control over the outcomes in my life, which I think is interesting given kind of the space that I'm in right now, probably really the space a lot of people are in the world today, with the economy where it's at and the political climate, all of the different things that are happening. It's interesting, especially if it's important to people. Maybe it's not important to everyone to have that degree of control over the outcomes in their life, but I know for me it is. And then certainly around participation, I think being able to participate, and most importantly, from the vantage point of, am I asked to be included? Am I invited to the table? I think is extremely important for me to feel like I am a part of the conversation, versus maybe I'm not being excluded, but even if I'm not invited, that for me can feel like I'm being triggered to some degree because I'm not being invited to the table. And then I know we're going to talk a lot about fairness, and I believe that falls into kind of the protection kind of category, or the driving force of protection. But I know for me too, fairness is extremely important because I want myself, my family, people I care about, and really everyone in general in the world to be treated with fairness. And it's hard a lot of times to know that life just isn't always fair. And so how to deal with that from that perspective becomes really interesting. Phil, as you're describing this, I'm really interested, and I'm sure our listeners are too, as they get to know us better. What are some of the things that, as you are going through those 5 things, that are driving forces for you, whether it's the larger overall categories or driving force, or the sub layers and the individual triggers that you might want to share with the listeners?
Actually, I tend to be spread out over all, particularly the 3, whether it's protection or participation or prediction. My drivers at an even more granular level are: number 1 is fairness, very important to me, and that manifests itself in a number of ways. Being treated fairly for me, seeing other people be treated fairly, see classes of people being treated fairly, countries being treated fairly, and animals being treated fairly. It manifests itself in all those ways. So that's number 1. Number 2 is being in control of my own life. I've been an independent consultant or run my own company for longer than I care to admit, and that's why I want to be in control. Those are the top 2. But I want to come back on something you said, and that is the things that trigger us. What we look at is 2 different types of activity in the brain, if you like. One is, what is a trait that you have? And traits we have been in and probably with us since minute 1, even maybe at conception, we don't know. But certainly traits tend to show up early in life. Are you curious, or are you fearsome? Are you inquisitive? Are you outgoing or inward going? Those are some traits. Then there's the thing we call states, which is what's going on in your life today and in the recent past. And I'll give you an example. A lady I was working with some time back, and we were talking about what triggered her. If you'd have asked me that question 2 years ago, financial security would not have come up for me. I got laid off and I couldn't get a job for 9 months. Financial security is high on my list now of a state. Her trait was, not a big deal. So there's 2 types of things that we're looking at in here. And you did mention what's going on with everybody. Pretty much everybody in my environment at the moment is not feeling protected. If your threat is that maybe Medicaid is going to be taken away from you, that feels like a threat. Yeah. We're not necessarily able to participate the way we would want. Right. Stay at home working, COVID, for people who wanted to be around other people, that was a major threat. And on economically, politically, geopolitically, etc. at the moment, it's causing a lot of people to go, I can't predict what's going on. And so that's one of the reasons why I think you're seeing an increased angst in the whole population at the moment, is we're all under a higher level of threat than we ever have been in the past.
Yeah, I would agree. I think especially as we watch the news, or if you do watch the news, depending on which news channel you watch, it's just the amount of overwhelmingly negative information that's being shared is just so unfortunate. And I realize that there's a lot of things that are happening. And one of the things that I talk to my spouse about, and I talk to a lot of other people about, is how we find balance and being able to also search out the positive things that are happening to give ourselves a sense of encouragement. And then also how we consume that information, so that way you can consume it in a way that I choose to read more about it, so I can consume it in my own kind of emotional way versus through the emotions maybe of other people through the commentary that they give through the TV or whatever. But I think that it's interesting as we go through this, as we continue to share with people, Phil, that what's happening in the brain, and we really decode, right, what's happening in our lives, people will begin to make those connections and go, oh, that's why I'm really starting to experience that and what's happening there. One of the things, Phil, that we're going to just back up a little bit before we then conclude our episode, but it's something that I really do want to talk about because it is going to become a part of our conversation a lot as we go through, is around the non-conscious part of the brain. You mentioned it, and it's important, the 5 driving principles of the brain, as we go into the different pieces of just how we're experiencing life. And it was really around doing a double click on the modes. And where that comes in is around what is bias and then giving people an understanding of what does that mean. Because I think in our definition is a different contextually than perhaps what they may know it to be or have heard it described before. Irrational or maybe rhythm driven. So can you give them some information on that? And this is a precursor, listeners, for what we're going to be headed to in future episodes. And as you listen to it, you'll begin to make some connections to things we've talked about already today. But I think it's important that we help give some of this information to fully give the picture of what is happening in the non-conscious part of the brain, Phil.
Yeah. And I was interviewed about 6 or 7 years ago, and somebody was passing his 60th birthday. And he said, we were all asked, what do we wish we'd known many years ago? And my response was, I wish I'd known about the non-conscious brain. Because it drives the majority of what we do. If you just take the ratio of 1 in a million conscious to non-conscious, it's making decisions on your behalf, and then you're not even aware those decisions are being made. Yes, and we'll skip through this, and I might suggest that we actually skip through it now and maybe make that the topic of our next discussion and go deep dive there. So you mentioned a couple of them, but we're driven by biases, and I'll come back to what I mean by that at the moment. We are driven by stress, by rhythms in the brain. We're driven by no change. The brain doesn't like change. And we're driven by irrationality. So those are the 5 big ones. And we can repeat them again if you want. But let's bias, irrationality, stress, no change, and rhythms of the brain. So let's say biases. The biases, as you've implied, it's got a bad name for itself. But for biases, whether it's biases or habits or patterns, the brain loves to tidy things up. And we've identified something like 350 different biases that the brain has. We break them into 3 big buckets of bias. Number 1 is the one that's most obvious to us, and that is what we see in other people. Am I biased to either for or against someone with a beard and a bald head, for example? Some other things we could talk about there. So that's number 1, the obvious ones. Number 2 is what I'll call cognitive biases. And cognitive biases, we've identified something like 300 of them so far. They are things like, I'm more likely to listen to someone who's like me than I am to somebody who's not like me. I'm more likely to take on board a piece of information that ties in with what I already believe. So there's lots more of those. We'll go into them in a lot more detail. The bias is what we call neurodiversity bias. And that is the way that different people think and behave and act in society in general and in their meetings. Some people are very loud in meetings, and some people sit back and are quiet, right? We tend to be biased towards that, either for or against the loud one or for or against the quiet one. So those are neurodiversity biases. But let me step back a moment. And that if you look at the word bias, it's a shortcut for the brain. Brain having a mechanism by which if it doesn't have enough information or too much information, it can just shut down and go, this is the pathway I have to handle it. One piece of research, highly theoretical, of course, that basically said if we didn't have biases, our brains would explode in about 2 hours. So bias is, for the brain, it's a mechanism. That's all it is. It's not got a context or negative context. It's a mechanism. In society, the word bias has taken a negative connotation.
Very interesting. And I think, Phil, one of the things I want to underpin for our listeners as they were just listening to all of the things we just described, or that you just went through around a double click into the non-conscious part of the brain, is when we talk about bias, there really is this negative connotation that can sometimes be carried with that particular word from a societal perspective. And I think that it's important for folks as they listen to our podcast and they continue to tune into the episodes, that they understand that I would probably describe it as it's a functional process for the brain to be able to make decisions as you were just describing it from a shortcut perspective. And so I think for the listeners, it's really important and it hopefully illuminating to some degree that the brain's way of being able to shortcut decisions and doesn't really carry a negative or positive connotation. But from a societal perspective, certainly has carried that through there. And I just wanted to be able to share that with our listeners and really underpin that as we move forward in the podcast episodes.
So let me ask you a question. What is the last two numbers of your social security number?
83.
83. 83. It's towards the high end. Mine's 65, which is high, but closer to the middle. So 83. You ever really thought about it before?
No, only when I have to enter it in somewhere.
Right. But what I'm doing right now is I'm keying in and anchoring into your brain the number 83. Experiments show that if you were now to go off and do other things that were numerically oriented, that number would influence your choices. The experiment's been done around, particularly around you would pay in an auction. You would pay more than I would in an auction for the same thing because I nudged your brain to think higher than mine.
Interesting.
And yet you wouldn't have even known about it. So do you drink wine?
Occasionally.
Occasionally. Do you ever go into a wine store or a liquor store?
Yeah.
Okay. If that liquor store or wine store has a surplus of, so for example, French wine, if they play French music, you are more likely to choose French wine. Again, completely non-consciously and relatively irrational, unless you happen to love French wines.
Interesting. I also think a word that, for myself anyways, maybe gullible to some degree. You're welcome to plead the fifth, but that's how it sounds to me. Am I just is my brain falling for something that it shouldn't be falling for? Because now I'm 83 is, okay, now I'm going to go and auction or bid higher on something, even though it's not valued at that, or I'm going to buy French wine simply because French music is playing. It's fascinating.
We'll go into a lot more detail about irrationality moving forward. The next one is stress. One of those triggers that we were talking about earlier on are really the result of that threat is stress. Mm-hmm. So one of the things people talk a lot about is stress management. The first step of stress management is understanding what stresses you. And so if you can go into the more granular analysis of those 5 driving forces we were talking about, you can help people understand where their stress is coming from. Now, we need stress. If we didn't have some stress in our lives, we'd probably die. But it's like Goldilocks. There's an optimal amount of stress for all of us. And what that optimal amount is for you in certain situations, again, it's a powerful way of understanding how to manage stress. So we'll come back to that in a lot more detail when we look at the session on stress. Change. The brain doesn't like change. And I tell you, it's not just a psychological issue. It's actually a physiological issue in the brain. Is for anything that comes up, the brain builds up a mental picture. We call them schemas. The brain has got this schema, a mental picture of everything, whether that's a banana, a house, a car, a television. And all the while that data arrives, those cues arrive, extra data and information comes in, and it aligns with our schema, we're very happy. In fact, we get a little reward if something new comes in. If something comes in that disagrees or is the opposite of that schema we're holding, then our brain doesn't like it. It doesn't like change. So when people turn around and talk about how people change, when you're working on change, most change management efforts fail because we work on the conscious part of change. We don't the non-conscious part of change. You have to. The last one is rhythms. We've got multiple rhythms that impact our brain, and they are either monthly, daily, or even hourly. Monthly, there's some obvious ones, particularly for females, but we think that applies probably to men as well, but it's less proven. And we've got 2 types of things that impact our daily rhythm. One is, and I'll stop myself for a moment. Do you tend to do your best work in the morning or late at night?
Typically in the morning.
Okay. We would call you a lark because you're up earlier in the morning. And by the way, female larks tend to, on average, get up earlier by about half an hour than male larks.
Interesting.
Then the other end of the scale is what we call an owl, that they do their best work at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. We are all driven by, tend to be that as an over. In addition to that, there's what we call the circadian rhythm, a rhythm that occurs for all of us. As we wake up in the morning, we get better and livelier and smarter until about midday. And then we downhill. And for some people, there's a kicker. They get a second wind, 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And then it goes downhill and the thing starts all over again. It's called the circadian rhythm. There's another rhythm that impacts that, and that is called the ultradian rhythm, which is about a 90-minute rhythm. You've heard of REM sleep, all right, where you go in and out of sleep like a curve? Well, that occurs during the day, but it also happens that it goes on it occurs during the night. It also happens that it goes on during the day. And that 90-minute rhythm is superimposed on the circadian rhythm.
Interesting.
So
Absolutely fascinating.
Biases, irrationality, stress, no change, and rhythms are 5 of the things that are going on in that non-conscious brain of ours.
Yeah. And out of general curiosity, Phil, when it comes to being an owl or a lark, are you one or the other, or maybe possibly somewhere in the middle?
It is. We actually do have the people that are in the middle. I'm probably in the middle now. I used to be an owl.
Okay.
When I was at university, I pull overnighters. It's easier if you're an owl. When I got into the workplace, I actually, by dint of what I was doing, I became more of a lark. Now I think I'm in the middle.
Okay. So you migrated from different points of the day.
Yeah. And some people don't migrate, some people do.
Okay. Very good. So, Phil, we've shared a tremendous amount of information today with the listeners, and I'm sure they're going, holy moly, there's just so much that I have learned today. There's so much that I'm wanting to learn more about, that I want to ask questions around. One, we're definitely going to have in the show notes, there will be an email address that our listeners can certainly go ahead and email us questions if they have questions around anything that you've heard today, or comments that you would like to share with us, or stories. If it's something that you don't mind us sharing in future episodes, please let us know. If it's something that's more confidential and you don't want it being shared on an episode, please note that in your email as well, so that we keep that off of the show and it's just something we'll respond back to you on an individual level. But we'll certainly put that in the show notes for you. But there has been a tremendous amount of information that we've shared, and our brains are truly a spectacular part of our existence and help us do so many things. And so I just feel, as you think about everything that's been shared today, how would you like to summarize and wrap things up for folks, and maybe even give them a precursor of what to expect in future episodes?
All that information in the next 20 words or less is going to be difficult. I think understanding your brain will help you become a better spouse, a better person, a better leader, a better member of a team. All of those things, if we can understand the brain, then you have a chance of actually improving what's going on in your life. Next, we'll probably, in the next session, I'm going to suggest that we dig into the non-conscious and look at biases in greater detail, look at what causes stress in greater detail, all those type of things. So I think that's probably our next session. And I'll just share with everybody, the listeners, an article I read, scientific article I read this morning, which was that having hope actually probably is better for us than just having a direction towards having happiness. So just leave our listeners with that. Hope's important.
Absolutely. I know it is in my life. Hope is being part of being able to probably feel happy, quite honestly. I absolutely love it. So thank you for tuning in to episode 1 of Brainwise, Our Lives Decoded. We'll see you next week.